Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. I have the pleasure today of introducing our speaker, Yawei Liu. He is Senior Advisor of the China Focus Program at the Carter Center. He got his undergraduate degree in '82 from Xi'an University, got an MA from the University of Hawaii in '89 on recent American history. He's one of our own. He got his PhD at Emory in '96 at an American political and diplomatic history. He's Associate Director of the China Research Center in Atlanta. This center's aim is to use in-depth research to provide us with a better understanding of China. He recently helped launch a new magazine called USChina Perception Monitor. If you Google that, you can find the magazine. He's been a member of numerous Carter Center missions to monitor local Chinese elections. He's edited 3 book series, Rural Election and Governance in Contemporary China, both in 2002 and 2004. And maybe most interestingly, he's author of a book called Obama, The Man Who Will Change America in 2008. So I'll turn it over to our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for that introduction. Thank you, Gray, for inviting me to speak to Emory faculty and staff who have retired. I guess I will also eventually retire as a staff of Emory because working at the Carter Center, we're all staff of Emory University. So I will share my PowerPoint. And so what I will do today is I will start my presentation from the sound and fury of US-China relations at this moment, and then go back to history, to the very beginning of the bilateral relationship, and then come back to China relations at this moment, and then go back to history, to the very beginning of the bilateral relationship, and then come back to the present and to try to figure out what is the future of this most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. So the 3 questions I hope you're going to keep in mind is number 1, how did US lose China? And number 2, how did China lose America? And the most important question is, could the 2 still rediscover each other? So with that, I'll speak for about 40 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open for questions from you guys. So where is the relationship right now? I assume all of you are very much aware of, because there's a lot of report on the relationship. So here are 3 documents that came out respectively in 2017, 2018, and May the 20th this year. Basically, it officially declared what was initially began by President Nixon, when he made the ice-breaking trip to China in 1972, the policy of engagement over. So US and China are no longer partners. We'll talk about that later. During the presidential debate, particularly, I think the town hall, the last presidential, the vice president debate, the question was posed to both Trump and Biden, as well as Harris and Pence. But all candidates decided they're not going to talk about China. So the election really revolves largely around domestic issues. Although on the foreign policy side, the most important issue, for the incoming president, Joseph Biden, is probably, in addition to repairing the alliance system, is how to deal with China. So if you look at some of the quotes of these 3 reports, is number 1, US will have to confront the rise of China and second, to prevent Beijing from hurting the core interests of the US, its allies, and partner countries. Protect the American people, homeland, and way of life, promote American prosperity, preserve peace through strength, and advance American influence. That came from the last report called the Strategic Approach to China that came out on May the 20th, 2020. So if you read these as if China poses an existential threat to the United States. And I think this is widely shared bipartisan. That is, in Washington, D.C., where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party disagree on almost everything, they do agree with each other on the threat posed by China to the United States. So the next few slides, you'll see examples of how things have changed. So here is basically a reflection of what's going on in Congress. And I think as we speak now, there are over 300 acts that are pending in Congress, all designed to deal with China. So here are just 3 examples of laws that were recently adopted by Congress. Number 1 is the Taiwan Travel Act. Number 2 is the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act. And most importantly is the Taipei Act. When President Carter made the decision to normalize US-China relationship, Congress was so upset. So Congress adopted an act called the Taiwan Relations Act. So for the past 40 years, there was only one act that Congress passed in order to defend Taiwan, so to speak. But more recently, 3 acts were passed, and all were designed to change the status quo of this trilateral relationship. That is China, US, and Taiwan. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is extremely dangerous because China considers Taiwan part of China. And all these acts are perceived by Chinese to encourage Taiwan independence. If Taiwan does change the status quo, that, according to the Chinese secession law, anti-secession law, that means war. And China has never, US wants China to say, they will resolve the Taiwan issue peacefully, but China has never denounced, abandoned the use of force. And recently, China actually has done everything to let the world know that it is determined to use force if Taiwan goes too far down that road. The next few slides are speeches, words, rhetoric from American leaders. I disagree with a lot of the rhetoric, but that is what is coming from the State Department, from the Justice Department, from FBI, and from National Security Council. So these are some examples. When Pompeo visit foreign countries, it seems to me he has only one message for that particular country. That is, you guys need to work with us. We need to contain China. We need to eliminate China as a threat. If you don't do that, your country is going to go down. And that is what the US State Department has been doing, I think, since 2018, particularly after Secretary Pompeo came to the office. So I'm not going to read these, but you guys can see it. Is how serious the threat is, according to American officials. Here, I do want to make a point. That is, President Trump himself is not fully engaged on these issues. For him, the most important thing is the trade deficit. That's why he launched the trade war against China. And President Trump himself is not very interested on human rights issues in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, and he's not interested in Taiwan either. However, he actually, many US-China relationship scholars would make the following comment, that China's best friend in Washington, D.C. is President Trump. He's actually doing everything to contain this anti-China contingent in DC, to do a lot of things. However, the pandemic has changed everything. And now he lost the election. He's going to blame China even more. So I think right now the concern from China, as well as from many here in the US, is what is he going to do in the next 73 days before he gets out of the office, both domestically, but also in the foreign policy arena, and particularly whether he's going to burn all bridges between US and China so that this relationship cannot be restored easily after Biden comes into the office. So this is from Robert O'Brien, his Phoenix speech back in late June or early July. And again, some of the examples. I think one core message from top American security leaders, diplomatic leaders, is that the engagement policy with China that was begun by Richard Nixon is wrong, it's misleading. It has benefited China very much, but the US actually is a victim of that policy. So therefore, that policy of engagement has to be abandoned. The other thrust of these American leadership rhetoric is it's a new effort. The effort is to distinguish the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese people. So in all these speeches now, you see the Chinese Communist Party. They also refer to the Chinese leader no longer as President Xi Jinping, but as Secretary General Xi Jinping. The Chinese top leader obviously holds three most important offices. He is the president of the country, he is the Secretary General of the party, but most importantly, he's also the commander-in-chief. In China, that title is called the chairman of the Central Military Commission. But China is a party state. At one point, US Congress is deliberating on passing a law to prohibit any member of the Chinese Communist Party from coming to the US, and also their direct relatives from coming to the US. I don't know to what extent members of Congress know how many party members that are there in China. Early on, I heard a conversation about the votes, in the particular Georgia County, 535 or something like that. So in terms of party, China has close to 100 million party members. Of course, that is out of a total population. China, like the US, is doing the census now. I think the estimate now is over 1.4 billion people in China. So that's about 1/14 of the population. But if you include their direct relatives, then we're probably talking about 300 to 400 million people from China, if that law is passed, that they're not eligible to visit the US. That probably will include all the visiting scholars, researchers, and also students whose parents are probably party members. And before the pandemic, there are close to 400,000 Chinese students that are studying in American colleges and universities. So this is the most the symbolic meaning of breaking away from the policy of engagement is Pompeo traveled to Yorba Linda, California, and delivered this speech. And behind him is the birthplace of Richard Nixon. And he got one of the grandsons of Richard Nixon to come endorse it. And again, you from this you will see, the CCP will erode our freedom and the rule-based order that our society have worked so hard to build. I think, does China pose a threat? Probably, but is that threat that serious to the U.S.? Not, I guess it's, you guys, after my presentation, you guys can decide whether that threat is serious or it's a threat, but it's not, an existential threat to American way of life. And also the way they approach other countries is that you have to work with us. But then you look at how President Trump has burned bridges with the allies, with NATO, with EU, with Japan, and with South Korea. But on the other hand, they want all these countries to work with them to contain China. And so much so that no one really anticipated that the US government was going to go as far as shutting down the Chinese Consulate General in Houston. So these are the pictures of the shutting down of the consulate. After that, interestingly enough, there's not much about why the US government decided to shut down. At the time, from the State Department and the spokesperson, as well as David Stilwell, who is the Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, is that this consulate, Georgia is actually under the jurisdiction of this. If you guys go to China, you apply for visa, you have to go to Houston to do it. Is that the Houston Consulate General of the People's Republic of China is a center of espionage, that it supports the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party's effort to steal American secrets. Although you hear that a lot. FBI Director Christopher Wray basically said every 10 hours we open an espionage case against an ethnic Chinese. Be it someone like me who are naturalized citizen or a green card holder, or someone that is on the J visiting scholar visa or on the H visa. Every 10 hours, they open a case. Again, to what extent is that accurate? And how many of them are being convicted so far, including our Emory professor that were, I don't think that the Emory University actually shut down his lab. But eventually, he was convicted not of espionage, not of stealth of research information, but of tax evasion. So he was fined, I think, $30,000 or something, which I think, you guys are all here. That's my personal view, is that the arrest of Professor Lee and his wife and the shutting down of the lab actually has done a lot of damage to the reputation of Emory University. One, all president of other leading university in China saying, we're not going to go racial profiling. We are going to defend and protect our researchers, regardless where they're coming from. And Emory top leadership is actually quite silent on this issue. If Emory is going to hire more researchers and professors, if these professors, researchers have a choice of coming here or going anywhere else, if they learn about that case, I think they're going to give it second thought in terms of whether they're going to come to Emory or not. So that decision to close the Chinese consulate also, of course, China has to retaliate. So China closed the American consulate in Chengdu. So here in this picture with his ethnic Chinese wife and their kids is the American Consul General in Chengdu, who actually, as a student, studied abroad. He was an American student who studied in Sichuan University, and Chengdu is the capital city of the province. So after this, which at the time really is a shocker, that people on both sides were thinking, what else the U.S. government is going to do. I think China tried to maintain calm and patient, not to be provocative, but China has to respond if you, for example, in the case of shutting down the consulate, and China has to retaliate, and so that's where the relationship is. Of course, there's later decision to potentially ban TikTok, that has 100 million US registered users, and also WeChat, that most of the American businesses that sell things or export things in China use the WeChat. It's kind of the equivalent of Facebook. For now, I haven't heard more. So basically what the administration did is basically to say to the Chinese company of TikTok that you have to sell. If you don't sell, then we're going to shut it down. So the updated status of that is Oracle and Walmart. They're going to buy the TikTok operation in the US, in UK, and in New Zealand, and possibly Australia, forcing China to sell. Otherwise, we're going to shut it down. And also more recently, which is not here, is US government sent top rank cabinet level officials to Taiwan. And that is considered by China as provocative, as one way of recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign and independent country. And lastly, US, the Trump administration is selling arms to Taiwan, with great abandon, including F-16s. So that's where the relationship is now. Now going back to the very beginning of this relationship, I thought Professor Michael Hung, who retired from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, wrote a book entitled "The Special Relationship." The book is about U.S.-China relationship, and he said that was very special because China holds a very special place in the American imagination. If you read the book, you'll see, the entire relationship began with commercial endeavors to China, which was followed by missionaries. When merchants and missionaries are both in China, and when the Chinese were a little bit concerned about all these foreigners and Americans coming into Middle Kingdom, the center of the universe, to bother and heckle them, they started telling them that we don't want you to be here. So that's when the merchants and the missionaries started demanding U.S. government to extend protection. So the flags follow the merchants and the missionaries. So very quickly, some interesting point is 1492, Christopher Columbus, discovered America, but his trip really was not to discover America, but to go to China, to go to the east by sailing west. What he had during that trip is a letter from the Spanish queen and king to the Chinese emperor, and a book by Marco Polo. So a lot of people in China would claim, had it not been for us, this new continent was not going to be discovered. And then the Chinese would also say, we contributed to the coming of the American Revolution because the Boston Tea Party, the tea that was dumped into the harbor, also came from China. And then after the Republic was founded, they started thinking, let's go and make money in China. So 1789, the first commercial ship, Empress of China, called the Empress of China, sailed from Boston to China and came back with a huge profits. So that, that China is such a place that where we can make a lot of money, that psyche that mentality is still with a lot of American corporations and business people. And then the US signed the first treaty with China to protect American citizens back in 1844. If you look at that treaty, it's very interesting because in the treaty, it specifically said Americans should be allowed to learn how to speak Chinese. Americans should be allowed to bury themselves if they die in China. So before the treaty, this is all illegal. That the Chinese, the court, the last dynasty of China, prohibited foreigners from doing these things. And of course, there's such a thing called most favored nation. So when US signed a treaty, all the privileges extended to US would go to all the other countries. So moving fast forward, from the early years of the relationship to more recent events. So these are four, I consider, most critical moments in recent history in US-China relationship. So the first one is the open door notes. The open door notes was a US State Department memorandum to other Western powers in 1899 and in 1900 is when 8 countries banded together and invaded China because the Chinese started killing missionaries and foreign merchants. So at this time, US had a clear sense that the British, the French, and others, they are going to divide China up. So America, which is a latecomer to China, basically said no country should be allowed to colonize China. China should be open and accessible to all powers. So really, US was a champion of Chinese independence and sovereignty at this time. But this document at the time was not backed up by any executive actions, but it's a principle, it's a policy that eventually triggered the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor because US would not allow Japan to colonize China. The second most critical moment is Paris Peace Conference. This is after World War I. You see the picture of President Wilson at the top left. So at this conference, most of the Chinese elite, the intellectuals, put their hope on President Wilson, basically to say, we need sovereignty, we need our land taken by Germany to be returned to China. But Japan wanted that Jiaodong Peninsula, and Japan threatened that if Wilson did not grant that land to Japan, they're going to walk out of the League of Nations. And also, Japan had a declaration on racial equality that President Wilson certainly is not going to take. So as a concession, Wilson agreed that the land was going to be returned, not to China, but given to the Japanese. That created the most drastic disappointment and disillusionment with the US specifically, but in general with liberal democracy. Because these Chinese elite all believe that democracy is the way to go. But after this, what they considered as a sellout, they actually look to Moscow. I think this is really a very unfortunate moment. The Communist Party was established 2 years after the Paris Peace Conference. And then moving forward is 1946, 1945, 47 is World War II ended. But China then degenerated potentially into a civil war between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. And President Truman wanted to see a unified China, a prosperous China, a free China. He didn't want to see the two political parties to fight against each other. So he sent General Marshall to China to try to mediate. Both parties agreed to peace, but the two parties resented and hated each other. Marshall Mission, even though both parties came together, as soon as he left, the two parties started fighting against each other. If U.S. mediation following the end of World War II succeeded, then if the Mao and Chiang Kai-shek, if they all agree with the U.S. vision for China, then China is certainly, the history had to be rewritten. China could be a democratic, multi-party political country, which is going to be hugely different from today. And finally, in August 1949, the Communist Party defeated the Nationalist Party, and U.S. Ambassador Leighton Stewart wanted to stay. Unlike all the other diplomats that they left the capital city, Nanjing, they all relocated to the southern city of Guangzhou, Canton. But Leighton Stewart felt that this is the party that will be in power, that we, U.S. government, should try to establish formal relationship. But his proposal recommendation was rejected. And Mao was very upset that U.S. was not respecting his leadership. So he penned this article called Farewell to Leighton Stewart, who is actually a Southern missionary. He was born in China, and he founded one of the most important universities, Peking University in China. And he wanted to be buried in China. And that wish was met I believe in 2005. Finally, his ashes returned to China and was buried in Hangzhou. And then quickly, the Korean War, which the China side just commemorated the 70th anniversary of the Korean War. And for those who are watching this commemoration, particularly here in the US, there is a lot of concern. Why China is commemorating this war at this time? Obviously, for China, the war was important. From the Chinese perspective, is that for a country that just emerged from brutal civil war, was able to fight the most powerful power in the world to a standstill. That's something to be proud of. Which I think we shouldn't criticize for them to commemorate it. But then the leadership, in his speech, Xi Jinping said, the lesson we learned from Korean War is that to avoid war, you have to fight a war. That message at this point, I think is a source of great concern for people here as well as for people in China. I think that reflects the Chinese determination that if US is going to push Taiwan to go independent, then China is going to fight a war, and the US is going to be involved in such a war because there are all these laws that are on the books. Very quickly, this is in 1957 when Mao actually believed at that point that the socialist world, we're talking about the Cold War at the peak, that the eastern side, Moscow and Beijing, they're going to prevail in this confrontation. But Mao's thinking is literally not only just irrational, but totally crazy and out of his mind. He's saying we have so many people, right? Even if US is going to throw the world into a nuclear war, half of our population is going to survive, and eventually will be able to outnumber the imperialist world, the capitalist world led by the US. Ironically, that trip by Mao to Moscow, his second overseas trip, was the beginning of the Moscow-Beijing fallout. And Khrushchev was very unhappy about Mao's craziness, and he started to rein Mao in, and Mao, being as proud and arrogant as he was not someone that was going to basically say, I'm your little brother, I'll do whatever you tell me. I think currently the situation is a little similar. It's not, back then is Mao competing for global leadership of the international communist movement. Right now, US is seeing Chinese leader competing for global leadership in the world. Of course, the circumstances are very different. China recently, in recent years, like to complain that US is interfering with domestic affairs. Even the Carter Center, our work in China to promote grassroots election is a great concern for the Chinese government. We're blacklisted. I think we are defined as category 2 threat to Chinese national security because what we're trying to promote. But China actually interfered with American domestic affairs. I think Mao and other leaders in the 60s and in the late 50s, they believed that African Americans and the poor white, that they're going to work together and they will be able to overthrow the US government controlled by Wall Street financiers. So that's Mao's very naive perception. You see Mao's meeting with W.E.B. Du Bois, with Robert Williams, with Huey Newton, and particularly in 1968. That's when Mao really believed US, after MLK was assassinated, that US was engulfed by this racial tension and the days of American leadership, of American supremacy are numbered. But then the next year, there's the border clash between Soviet Union and China, and Soviet Union actually threatened to use nuclear weapons on China. That obviously made Mao very concerned. And at the same time, Richard Nixon, by 1969, he already won the election. But in 1967, he wrote an article in the Foreign Affairs, and he basically said, we need to bring China into the global community. If China stayed outside, that would be an angry nation with 700 million people who wanted to overthrow the United States. So this is the birth, really 1967 is the birth year of the engagement policy. So you can only induce change by engaging China. If you don't engage China, then China is not going to change. If China is not going to change, then China is a threat to the US and to the entire global community. So these are pictures of the 1972, February of that year, Nixon made this ice-breaking trip to China. Now, I want to mention one thing is no Democratic president could do such a thing like this because the Democrats are always known as being soft on communism. I talk about loss of China. In 1949, the Truman administration was accused by McCarthy, by Richard Nixon himself and the others as losing China, that they didn't do much to stop the rise of Communist Party. But even more serious is that State Department and other federal agencies were penetrated by communists. That led to the rise of McCarthyism. So Nixon, when Nixon said we need to have a relationship with China, then all the politicians, the people say, oh yeah, that he's not being soft, but he made that decision for the good of the US, for our national security. So the Republican Party really didn't have that baggage. So the first picture on the left, Nixon extending his hand to shake the hand of Zhou Enlai, the premier of China at the time. He was very deliberate because there is an unverified story that when Secretary John Foster Dulles met or ran into Zhou Enlai in Geneva during a meeting on Vietnam. Zhou extended his hand to Secretary Dulles, but Dulles turned around and left. So that was considered as a humiliation. So Nixon wanted to correct that image of at least an impolite American. And the other picture I want you to pay attention is the next picture. Look at Nixon with chopsticks in his mouth and how puzzled he was. I think that's a good footnote, kind of like the cultural gap, which led to misunderstanding and misperception of the two countries. The Chinese way of showing their warmth and hospitality is to get dish into your dish, to eat as much as you can. Of course, they do it with their own chopsticks, and this is not something that Americans are used to. So that's why I think Nixon had that huge frown on his face. But the Chinese leader simply want to make him feel at ease and at home to eat as much as he can. Now we're talking about our native son. President Carter obviously had a baggage. He's a Democratic president, but he made the decision to normalize relationship between U.S. and China. So that was 7 years, close to 7 years after Nixon's trip in February 1972. So that decision was made December the 15th, 1978. And that was wrongly condemned by the Republican Party. So Reagan at this time already announced that he was going to run for re-election. So he visited Taiwan and told the Taiwanese that, were I elected the president, I'm going to reverse President Carter's decision. Of course, he didn't do that after he was elected and became president in 1981. George H.W. Bush published an op-ed in Washington Post and accused President Carter of being unchristian. You're not supposed to sell out your friend like this. And Barry Goldwater sued President Carter all the way to the Supreme Court, saying to establish a relationship with China, President Carter actually violated the Constitution. The Constitution actually gave President Carter all the power to do that. How important is this decision? This is the most important Chinese foreign policy achievement, is that finally US turned around and decided to allow China to come into the international community. So that decision obviously was made the China time, December the 16th, 1978. 2 days later, the Chinese Communist Party had a very important meeting and decided to introduce economic reform. So these two events laid the foundation of the rise of China that we're talking about today. Had US not normalized relationship with China, had China not abandoned its past policy of class struggle and decided that economic development is the primary mission of the party, then China today would be just like North Korea, if not worse. So that's very important. That's the turning point. So from 79 to 89, this is really the honeymoon of the relationship. The top leaders were visiting each other. I was asked to pay attention to the body language of the picture in the middle by Oval Shell, who was a New York Times reporter when Deng Xiaoping visited US in February 1979. He said, look at that body language, how warm the relationship was, and how Carter and Deng Xiaoping saw each other. And also the top left picture of President Bush Senior, he was a US the second US envoy to China when there was no embassy. So he and Barbara, they like to bicycle around in Beijing, in Hutong, in the lanes. So in February 1989, he went to Tokyo to mourn the death of Hirohito, the emperor. He said, I would like to visit China, but particularly I want to go where I used to bicycle. And China allowed him to stop the motorcade, to come out to greet the Chinese people that he befriended when he was the envoy, US envoy to China. That was in February. In June, tanks rode to the Tiananmen Square. So this is what we know as the Tiananmen massacre. And so this is the person that we don't know. This is the most powerful picture of that whole massacre. We don't know who this person is. We don't know whether he's still around. And I don't know when we'll be able to find out what really happened. But he was courageous enough to stop a column of tanks from rolling to the square. So there was global sanction imposed on China as a result of what happened in June 1989. US also imposed sanctions, but President Bush at that time still believed that engagement is very important. If you don't engage China at this point, China may go back to the bad old years before 1978. So he dispatched the picture on the right. He dispatched his national security advisor, General Brent Scowcroft. He first paid a secret visit in July, and then there was a public visit in December. I think the messages are clear that we are imposing sanctions, but we're not turning back on China. We will continue to trade with China. We'll continue to invest in China. We hope China is going to stay engaged with the global community instead of going back. And China really was going back in those days until you see the left picture. Deng Xiaoping decided that because in Beijing, nobody paid any attention to him. So he had to go all the way to the south, to southern China, and talked about opening up and the reform. And the Chinese military finally decided that was the policy to go. And they came out and they said, we will escort reform and opening up. So that episode is known as the Southern Tour of 1992. So I think US and China worked hand in hand from 89 to 92 to prevent China from sliding back to the bad old days of communism, to have China stay engaged globally so that China could focus on growing its economy rather than political persecution. So I think the rest is history. So this chart shows how the Chinese economy took off after 1992, and particularly after 2001, when China again was allowed by the US to join the WTO. Now, I think Pompeo and others are saying that was a mistake to allow China to join WTO. China made a lot of pledges. China agreed that they're going to make Western foreign American companies equal access to compete with Chinese companies. All these things were never really materialized. But you see the trajectory of China's rise. So that, of course, there are many other things that happen in between, but I don't want to linger there. I want to sort of go quickly to the fact that American perception, American thinking of China has started to change. Back in 2005, you look at the top left picture in the middle, that's Robert Zoellick, who later became the president of World Bank. He talked about a new concept of how the relationship is going to be managed. And that concept is China is going to become a responsible stakeholder, that we, US and China, are not competitors. They're not allies either, but certainly they're not enemies. You know, they can find a way to work together to anchor peace and prosperity for China, for the US, and for the world. I think that's still the best definition in terms of how the relationship is going to be managed. But then Americans are frustrated and disillusioned that China has not changed much. So by 2008, 3 years later, James Mann came up with this little book called The China Fantasy. James Mann was LA reporter for a while, and now he's a author in residence at Johns Hopkins University. So in this little book, he said, China is not going to change. Our engagement policy believes that China, with the introduction of the market economy, with Western investment, with joint ventures, China will become politically liberalized. And he calls that a fantasy. China is not going to change. And he declares the Chinese way of development, the China model. The China model is a shiny wealth without liberty, poses a threat to our national security. So he was one of the earlier advocates of containing China. But back in 2008, he belonged to the minority camp. And then 2012, Kurt Campbell, you see at the bottom left, he was Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific Affairs, came up with a new policy called the pivot, also known as rebalancing to Asia, is that Asia is going to be the economic locomotive of the world. China is rising there, and China is posing a threat to other countries. US is also a Pacific country. We need to go there. We need to make sure that the Pacific is an open ocean. The air is an open space. We're not going to allow China, for example, to occupy the islands in the South China Sea. And finally, in 2015, Blackwell, top right, authored a report which called "We Need to Change Our Grand Strategy Toward China." We can no longer engage China. We have to engage and contain China at the same time. So that's a newly coined term called congagement. So you contain and engage China at the same time. So the Trump story, I'm not going to repeat it. It's a familiar story. The best way to describe it is he's a bull in the China shop, and he basically destroyed all the sort of conventional ways of engaging China, dealing with China, and he really pushed the relationship to the brink of total decoupling. I think at this point, we're living through it, and for me, I have even sharper experience of how both countries are mired in their own problems. That's why we're so excited by the outcome of the election. So U.S. since Trump became the president, America first, make America great again, has withdrawn from the world. But China actually has not really been able to get into the void, the vacuum, even though Pompeo and others are saying that China is doing that. If you go to Pew Research Center to look at the recent poll of how developed countries see China. The Japanese view is 85% of the Japanese people have a negative view of China. In Europe, I think France is 83% of the French people have a negative view of China. Here in the US is 73%. Now, barely a year ago, it's almost even 50-50. So what happened there? I think that's also something you probably are very familiar, is how China dealt with the pandemic in the early days. Lack of transparency, not providing enough information to the global community, but particularly even to the Chinese themselves. And after China managed to contain the virus, is this wolf warrior mask diplomacy, coercing other countries to thank China, all these things. It's, China's really, I think is getting very much isolated in the global community. Now, that's on the international front. Now, domestically, I think President-elect Biden has a very good view of the pulse of the country. He talked about pandemic, systemic racism, economic slowdown, and China's problem is just huge, growing gap between the rich and the poor, environmental pollution and corruption, but also in Xinjiang, how to manage the Muslim minority in Tibet. How do you deal with His Holiness Dalai Lama? They're outside China. He's not in good health. What will happen after he's incapacitated? China's economy has declined from double-digit growth now to not only single-digit. I think probably going to be around 2% to 3% more recently. So both countries are in search of a solution. U.S. obviously is through elections, and China, I want to laugh, is they always have meetings. It's the party meetings and not public meetings, and meetings we don't know how things are being deliberated and how decisions are being made. So it's unclear where the two countries are going to be in the short term, although there is concern that China has managed to contain the virus. Therefore, its economy, can be jump-started again, and that will put U.S. and European countries in a very awkward, if not bad, position. So here, for the next 5 minutes, is basically how do we manage this relationship? Certainly, I think the current administration's policy really hinges on regime change. That is, U.S. will not be happy. U.S. will not restore the relationship to normalcy unless the Communist Party changes. That is not going to happen anytime soon. And China, and particularly under the strongman leadership of Xi Jinping, it's not going to happen. And it's very dangerous. But then, how the two countries, the leaders and the peoples, are going to rediscover each other and figure out a way that the two countries can peacefully coexist and compete without hurting each other, compete without triggering a war. So I think, Nixon's initial engagement policy certainly is accurate, is correct. And I don't think we can really exaggerate the achievement of engagement. Because one thing President Carter likes to talk about is after the normalization of the relationship, there's no war. And it's all economic growth in that part of the world. That's the achievement of engagement. However, what Americans are frustrated is that China political system has not changed. The government continues to violate human rights. And of course, that violation has gone even worse now with what is being labeled as concentration camps being set up in the western province of Xinjiang in China. Up to 1 million Uyghurs are now being contained in those camps. So it's fair to say that the engagement policy has only induced economic change, has only led to the economic rise of China. China has become more powerful, but politically, China poses a bigger threat to the US and to the world. So I think where China is going to be, there are two major issues. Number one is what kind of nation will China aspire to be? But that, I think, is a decision that can only be made by the Chinese people. US and other Western countries can make a difference. And that difference will largely be put in place by pressuring the Chinese government to provide as much information as possible, to introduce choice, to introduce accountability according to their own pace and according to their own timetable. I don't think you can push China. You cannot threaten the Chinese Communist Party that if you don't change, then we're going to cut off the relationship. So that's I'm hopeful the people in China cannot accept the current political system, but then they are not in a position to overthrow it. So that has to be worked through. It may take years, decades, but it may happen quickly. It just depends what is going to happen, what is going to unfold in China. So that's one. Number two is what kind of international order will China propel and defend? I think on this front, at least for now, China is defending globalization. China has made it very clear that we have benefited from globalization, from this global order initially established by the US and defended by the US, and China is not going to challenge that. So on that front, I think there's a lot of exaggeration that China is creating chaos or is destroying the global order. China has certainly done things that are obnoxious, that people don't like. But if you compare what China has done in the past 4 years and to what the Trump administration has done in the past 4 years, I think China, in terms of maintaining a mutually, not mutual, but globally beneficial order, China probably is more productive than the US, such as US withdrawing from WHO, while China is actually contributing millions of dollars to the WHO. So I want to end my sort of story of the two countries on how President Carter sees this relationship. So President Carter, I'm not going to go through everything here, but I think one very important issue President Carter has made clear here is that how China is governing itself, how Chinese people choose their leaders. That's really the business of the Chinese people. America, particularly American government, you can use examples to say how good your system is, but you cannot coerce and force the Chinese people to rise up to fight against the Chinese Communist Party. But a more important issue that the Westerners have to maybe accept is the wrong word, is to see that this, if I'm allowed to use the obnoxious or disgusting political system, one-party system, no freedom of worship, no freedom of media, no freedom of speech. But this system does lead to economic growth. And this system, at least in terms of containing the virus, it is working. And it has also led to the alleviation of poverty among hundreds of millions of Chinese. So African countries, some Latin American countries, are now looking at the Western liberal democratic system plus market economy and the Chinese authoritarian system plus a mixed economic system, market and command economy. And they say, well, the Chinese system is result oriented, at least, to say the least. So that system, even if it's not perfect, is that system, should be, it's hard to say what some Americans want to say is that that system does not deserve to exist under the sun, or to make it in the political science term is, does that mean a clash of civilization? Can these two systems peacefully coexist? If or the Chinese system, just like the Soviet Union, even if the Bolshevik system is gone, but Putin and Russia now are embracing a different system. So how do you manage the political difference between the two countries? That's President Carter's concern. I think what he's trying to say is, let's leave it there. Maybe into the future, let's see if we can work together. Now, in terms of working together, President Carter, I think this page is when he wrote that op-ed. There's no pandemic, but there's Ebola. U.S. and China did work together on Ebola in West Africa. So for now, I think these three things is what President Carter wants to see, and is what Chinese leaders wants to see, and hopefully the new American leadership wants to see. Number one is collaboration on fighting the pandemic, particularly on vaccine cooperation. Maybe not domestically, but outside China, working outside the US. So US and China working together, for example, to get vaccine to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America. Number two, climate change. I think President-elect Biden certainly sees that as an existential threat to the world. And certainly he is open to the idea that US and China can work together. And finally, regional peace and security. President Carter obviously thinks that without China, North Korean nuclear crisis cannot be resolved. And also the Iran nuclear situation. President Trump withdrew from the treaty. Whether Iran could be convinced or persuaded or enough incentive for Tehran to accept a second concession so that it's not going to develop its own bomb. I think we're at a critical moment. I'm hopeful the leaders and most importantly, the people like you and me, that we can work together to reduce misperception and misunderstanding, and hopefully the people through their leaders will be able to work out ways that this relationship can be managed for the benefit of the two countries, two great countries, and for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yahweh. That was incredibly fascinating and instructive. And now it's time for questions and comments.
Okay.
If you
Hi.
would like to ask a
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really enlightening. Do you think that it does seem the Chinese want to have world dominance in the economic sphere and also the political sphere? But my question is about the dominance, right? Is their objective to just be one of two or even three superpowers, or is it really to dominate politically?
Thanks, Denise. I think the in terms of whether China wants to dominate the world, I think the jury is still out. Even if China wants to dominate the world, it really doesn't have the resources to dominate the world. China has its own problems, as I mentioned. I think President-elect Biden actually has a very, I think, objective and quite correct view of China. Even though after he said that during his campaign in Iowa, he was wrongly criticized by other candidates. Biden basically said, China is going to steal our lunch? No way. China has this problem, that, so he has a litany of problems that China has. I think all these problems will remain with China, and China is not going to be able to dominate the world, and China is not going to be able anytime soon to overtake the US. You look at just on the military side, US probably has more than 200 military bases outside US proper. China has one logistic base in Djibouti that I visited. China, there's no way for China to project power. And China's domination, basically, if you look at the high-tech area, since the Trump administration imposed sanctions on high-tech Chinese companies, their cell phone, Huawei now have a problem to manufacture cell phones because China is not capable of manufacturing the SIM cards. That has to be purchased from the US, from Taiwan, from other sectors. And China's political domination is personally, I think, is even more unlikely, because nobody in the world likes the Chinese political system. That is one party, and now Xi Jinping wants to. He amended the constitution so he could serve. I think the recent speculation is because I said, Chinese party like to have meetings. So the recent meeting produced a 15-year plan, which indicates that he wants to be the top Chinese leader for another 15 years. That will take Chinese people to bear with him until 2035, by which time he will be at the same age as President Biden after he serves the first term, 82. Nobody likes this system, but nobody can do anything at this time because there's so much intimidation. And if you're a party official, you criticize the party, then you go to jail because you will be accused of corruption. And you look at the aging of the Chinese population, you look at the scarcity of water in China. None of this is making it that China to be a dominant power globally or overtaking the US. So I think that fear is unnecessary, although rhetorically China may sound like they're going to do it, but in reality, I don't think so.
If I could just ask, you say no one is interested in their form of government. I would say that somebody like Bolsonaro and many African countries would certainly be interested, because right now they have dictatorships, but they don't have any of the economic benefit from it. So it does seem like the Chinese model would be attractive to them if it brings them at least economic development and takes pressure off their corrupt dictatorships by creating more satisfaction in their populations.
Again, there are two sides to this story. I think on the one hand, the Chinese leader made the mistake of creating an impression that China wants to export authoritarianism. The evidence here is a collection of Xi's articles on governance, which was printed and then translated into 19 languages. I think a total of 600 million copies now being distributed global wide, which I think is just a shame. The Chinese way of governing cannot be replicated anywhere else. We've been working on this, and we talked to the Chinese and, if you're so good at alleviating poverty, why don't you go to our country? When I say our countries, Carter Center countries in Africa, to Ethiopia, to Sudan, to South Sudan, to Kenya, to see if how you alleviate poverty could be applied in these countries. And then the answer is no, there's nothing that really can be learned. So for the African leaders or the Brazilian leader you mentioned, that they want to apply the Chinese system, that's only for their own selfish interest. It really cannot be. And also I think China can say our system works because we're able to grow economy. None of these leaders in Africa can make the point that the system is good because I have delivered. They have not delivered economically. The country is not stable. There's civil war, there's religious strife, there are all these problems. So I think this has to be worked out. The Chinese government has certainly erred on suggesting to the outside world that their system can be applied elsewhere. If you look at the poll, I mentioned the poll, to see what kind of appeal China has in African countries, in Latin American countries, on those from US actually is polling much higher than China.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It's filled with very, very important information for us. Could you please talk about India in this mix of things? Because one of the things I heard President Trump emphasizing was an Indo-Pacific relationship of things that was going to somehow move in new directions. And then that has kind of disappeared a bit, but India is, it seems, playing a significant role economically in the world. And I'd like to hear you talk about India now in relation to China and the United States and these other countries, if you could, please.
Thanks, Vernon. I think that's a very good question. And so there are multiple dimensions to this question. So number one is what US wants. So Indo-Pacific that you mentioned is actually a strategy of the US government. So this strategy, if simplified, is a coalition of democracies. So that's US, India, Australia, Japan. So this was initially introduced by Prime Minister Abe of Japan, because Japan alone certainly cannot challenge China. And Japan is very much concerned about sort of the what was mentioned before, sort of the China's economic domination in East Asia. So US quickly grabbed this, and then recently Australia became more active, because one thing Australia did offended China a lot. That is, Australia introduced a resolution to the WHO to conduct an independent investigation of the origin of the virus in China. China was so mad. So this is known as China's coercive diplomacy that really now is isolating China. So Chinese government basically said, we're not going to eat Australian beef. We're not going to drink Australian wine. We're not going to send our students to study in Australian universities and colleges. And recently, the Chinese government said, we're going to stop buying Australian coal. Because the Australian economic growth really hinges on its relationship with China. But recently, because of this pressure, Australia is really mad and frustrated. And so Australia now is very proactive to join the Indo-Pacific coalition. Now, India is a different case, even though in June, for the first time, the border tension led to casualty on both sides. 20 Indian soldiers were literally beaten to death by the Chinese soldiers, because the Chinese and the Indians both agree that their soldiers are not going to carry arms. They're not going to shoot at each other. So they somehow got into this hand-in-hand combat. But I think both Indian government and the Chinese government realize for these two countries to go to war, no one is going to come out, reaping anything. It's going to hurt. However, the Indian government has imposed economic sanctions on China to ban over 200 applications. I talk about TikTok and these things. US actually is learning. It's one of the tools in the Indian toolbox. However, the economic relationship between China and India is, as far as China is concerned, it's minor. So China did not retaliate, and China, wants to fix the relationship with the U.S. first. China doesn't want to create an even worse situation for itself. So that's the second aspect of it. The third aspect is India serves as an example to China whether democracy works. So the most powerful evidence of the Chinese government to tell their people that democracy doesn't work is to cite the example of India. So they always say India is the largest economy in the world. It takes months to tabulate the votes each time there is an election. But look at the living conditions of the Indian people. Look at how many Indians are still in poverty. Although the Indian economy is really, I think it's the global leader right now. It's almost double digit in the past few years. So there is a Chinese American professor at MIT. His name is Yasheng Huang. He wrote a book in which he made the argument that India will have the last laugh, even though India economic performance is not as good as China. But in the long run, China will not have political stability, whereas India doesn't, is not concerned at political instability in China. So in the long run, China may be engulfed by its own instability, like the minorities, like the poor people, the farmers, and all those things, that eventually India will come out on top. So these are sort of the divided answer to your question. Lastly, my own hope is that both India and China are sort of civilization countries. Together, they have more than half of the global population. India actually has overtaken China on the population side. So with 3 billion people down there, if they can work things out, just the people in these two countries will be able to consume all the products produced by both countries. You'll keep your economy So on the growth for many, many, many years to come, you don't have to worry about exporting. You don't have to worry about tariff and all those things. So it's unfortunate that for the leaders of India and China not to be able to work something out. But this has a lot to do with Pakistan,
Yes.
which is probably, in addition to North Korea, China's only ally in the world. So there's, in addition to the economic welfare of the two countries, there's the security concern, and for India, territory, because India's population is growing. Every inch of land counts, is needed, and that's why India is not backing down on the territory. China actually has the tradition of backing down on territorial claims. It backed down in negotiation with Russia. It backed down in negotiation with Vietnam. It backed down in negotiation with some former Soviet republics. Somehow, it hasn't backed down when they're talking to the Indian diplomats on border issues. If border issues can be worked out, I think every other issue can be worked out quickly.
So I have two short questions. One is, why do we want to educate a lot of Chinese students here to send back to China? And two, is it not true that all Chinese companies must do what the government says? So in terms of, TikTok and Huawei, if they have information stored and the government said we want it, would they not have to give it up?
All right, in terms of Chinese students coming to study in the US, Chinese people just like the US. They like American universities and colleges. I came here to study. And I think in terms of international students, for almost, I think over 10 years, the Chinese students are the leading group. So that's one, they like to come here. And the US education is still the best in the world under the sun. The Chinese lacks innovation. If you look at their college education or even high school education, is so rigid. It is so politically geared. And now the faculty are now being surveyed by the students. Students can report on faculty that they're politically incorrect, and faculty could be easily dismissed. So that's one. Number two is in China, in order to go to a good university, you have to score high on the matriculation. So there, every year in June, there's a national exam. So a lot of the kids, particularly from rich families, are not able to get those into good universities. So their parents decide to send them to US, to Australia, to New Zealand, to European countries, universities to study. Number three, for China, is actually many who say now US is now imposing restrictions on the Chinese students to come over here. That's actually good for China, because at least my generation, and then those that are behind me, is they tend to stay here. I stayed, I didn't go back, which probably to a certain extent is a loss on China. It's a brain drain for China. Lastly, is we came here as graduate students, and graduate students, a lot of the time you can get scholarship. Emory gave me scholarship, so I don't have to even work when I was pursuing my PhD. So that's why I thank Emory and Coca-Cola, because it's a Wuju scholarship. So I don't drink Pepsi at all, and it's all Emory. Is that most of the Chinese students tend to stay over here. And lastly is now the majority of the Chinese students here are undergrad. They're paying full tuition. A lot of American liberal art colleges right now, their finance hinges on incoming of international students. I mean, including state-owned state universities, because they pay out of state international student tuition. That's a lot of money. I think billions. So if US has a deficit in terms of trade, but the US biggest surplus is in the education area, is there are only about 10,000, 20,000 students going to China to study, but that's only short-term study abroad. Those 400,000 Chinese students are here in colleges for 4 years of study, and then they go to graduate school and they pay tuition. So I hope that answers your question. Now, your second question is in terms of companies, whether they have to obey order from the government. China is a party state. Chinese sector are divided into SOEs, state-owned businesses. Of course, if you're state-owned, you have to obey. And then the private sector. The private sector, my sense is, if you want to have space in China, you want to continue to make money in China, then you cannot disobey an executive order from China. So that's the concern from the US government, is that TikTok, you're a private company, but the government goes to you and the government says, here, this is our national security law. By this law, we want data from the users of TikTok. Please give us the data. Then it's going to be very difficult, even though TikTok says we never provide such data. But in the Chinese setting, I think that's likely to happen. That's why data, AI, surveillance, they're going to be a huge issue for the two countries to manage. One recent example is the Ants Group. They want to go IPO in Hong Kong and in Shanghai. If they go IPO in these two stock exchange market, it will be the largest ever in the world. It's a financial company. But Jack Ma, the majority holder of this company, made some comments criticizing the Chinese government 2 days before Ants Group. If you Google Ants Group, you'll see 2 days before it went IPO, the Chinese government summoned him to a closed door discussion, and the IPO was canceled. So I think as long as the Chinese private sector is under such strict manipulation of the government, the US actually does not have to worry about China's economic domination, because private sector do not have the freedom. And that's also one issue US government wants to do, is you need to reduce the SOE sector. China made 2025 to the US is unfair because you always use national resources, which are not always at the expense of American companies. So American companies are in a disadvantageous position. If you want to have a level play field for the companies to compete, then you should reduce the privileges to the SOE, the state-owned companies, which Chinese government is very reluctant to reform that sector.
What about relations between Russia and China?
In terms of Russia, I think that Moscow-Beijing relationship is a source of concern for the US, because if the two strong men got together, you don't really know what they're going to figure out. Are they going to conspire, sort of to do something to destabilize the US and to create a trouble for the US? My own sense is emotionally or sentimentally, most of the Chinese are very critical of Russians. Talking about the century of humiliation, Russia was the country that grabbed the largest chunk of Chinese territory. Secondly, China actually imported the governing system from Russia. And a lot of people that are not happy with this kind of lack of freedom, they hate Russians. Of course, what U.S. is doing to Russia and China are uniting Moscow and Beijing. But I think at the bottom of the two peoples and maybe the leaders is that Russians and the Chinese don't really trust each other. So I heard from some of Biden's foreign policy advisors is that maybe now we should play the Russia card against China because, for example, China's Belt and Road Initiative, if the relationship between China and Russia is so good, then Russia is supposed to embrace that system. Russia actually is very concerned about the Belt and Road Initiative and told the Central Asian countries that you guys need to be careful and we don't want you to be penetrated economically by China. So I think the relationship is a very complex one. It will never develop to the extent, for example, to a UK US relationship or US NATO relationship. So that's your question. On the Spencer?
Yeah, I'll shorten it up. I was going to take you back to the pandemic and ask you. So the difference between the U.S. ability to control the outbreak and China's and the system, maybe it's not the system, because other countries in Asia controlled it quite well, like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, and everything. So is there something about the Asian mentality that is more open to collective action that is beneficial to public health than the Western idea that everybody should do their own thing? I'll leave it at that.
Pandemic issue, I agree with you that South Korea, Japan, particularly Taiwan, these are open, free, democratic countries. They have also done very well. And the fact that these countries are able to contain the virus probably has a lot to do with the culture, with its history. I think in the Chinese case is because the plague decimated so much of their people in the past. Is one the government said, you need this is a plague, this is a pandemic, you need to protect yourself. So they wear masks all together, and they don't challenge. But also, I think the way they impose quarantine, here in New York City, they say, well, you need to stay at home for 14 days. Nobody's going to check on whether you're, but if you go to China now, if I go to China now, they put me in the hotel, not of my own choosing. And I have to stay in that hotel for 14 days. I have to pay for everything. So that's how they do things. So the way they're able to do things, I don't think European countries or US are able to do. So it has a little to do with the system, but largely I agree with you. It's not just authoritarian system, more effective. Sometimes I look at Americans, go to Trump rallies and don't wear masks as if they're challenging the virus. And I don't think that's very productive. Now, Vernon?
Mine was a specific economic question. One of the results of Trump's trade war was that China stopped buying soybeans and beef in the United States. And I know they were trying to cultivate those products in exchange with countries like Brazil, et cetera. Has China been successful in finding other nations to get those goods, or has that hurt China's economy some?
the private sector, the economy, I think it's a very serious issue that has to be resolved by the party and by the government. There is the concern that maybe at the back of Xi's mind, he truly believes in communism. If he's a true believer in communism, then you don't believe in private ownership of anything. So the private sector's biggest concern is the loss of everything they have worked so hard to earn, being seized by the government without due process. That already happened. You accuse a business of being corrupt, and then you jail the business owner, and then the government seized all the private property. So that's why you see so much Chinese money outside China. I think if they can, the business sector, the private sector, they will move all their money out of China. That actually is also going to hurt China big time. So sometimes I talk about the formula of the private sector is, number one, to get their children out to study overseas. Number two, to get their money out. And number three, to get themselves out. And that I think is a threat to this rise of China that is creating so much concern. That's why I agree with President-elect Biden. There's no way for China to steal American lunch, period. I think I'll end my story here. Thank you all.
Just add one more question in the queue, and
Okay.
that is your assessment of how important the conflicts in the South China Sea are.
On the South China Sea, I think this is, in addition to Taiwan, this is a sticking issue between US and China. US in the past basically said, we don't take a position on sovereignty issues, but we are concerned about freedom of navigation. That position has changed. Recently, the State Department basically said, we are going to take a position, and those islands are not Chinese territory. So here, the issue really is not just the freedom of navigation, but resources and fishery, oil under the water. And I don't know how this is going to be resolved. My hope is China working with ASEAN countries, with the Philippines, with Malaysia, and with Vietnam, so that they can come up with something like a joint management. Same thing with Senkaku, Diaoyu Island with Japan, because those islands really are inhabitable. China certainly broke a promise. When Xi Jinping was here in September 2015, he said, we're not going to militarize the islands. That's why US and many other countries see that China has an issue with trustworthiness, that you say one thing, you do the other. South China Sea is a perfect example. So it's going to take time, but I think China has now a better understanding of the American determination that US is not going to let China get away with it. But to resolve this issue, China has to work with other countries so that these other countries, if China are able to get them out of sort of the US partnership, then things will be a lot easier. In terms of democratic grassroots democracy in China, they're not making progress. We used to work in China. The Carter Center started working in China on village elections back in 1998. That's when I joined the Carter Center. And then 2012, we were told, if you continue to work in this area, we're going to expel you from China. So you only have one choice, that is to work on promoting a better relationship, because President Carter normalized the relationship. So on that, and particularly Xi himself, after he amended the Constitution so that there's going to be no term limit, that's really backpedaling on political reform. That's why the entire world, including the US, are so upset about no political progress in China.
Thank you so much. It's really been fascinating. So grateful for your coming and answering so many questions. And I think on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you again, Yawei. It's been a real privilege having you here.
My pleasure. Thank you.